A turboprop plane slams into a desert in central Argentina.
22 fatalities. My God.
The aircraft was completely destroyed, burned, and the debris was dispersed approximately 200 meters.
Investigators are mystified by what they uncover.
Pull back harder!
Stop the playback.
And then they drop like a rock.
But exploring all possible causes.
Take a look. No failures.
Turns up nothing.
There's not a single red flag in his record.
Until a single microscopic filament provides the first clue to solving the case.
What's wrong? I don't know.
May the 18th, 2011. Neuquén, Argentina.
Okay, gentlemen, so here's what we're looking at for tonight.
Seoul Airlines flight dispatcher is briefing the pilots on tonight's flight to the port city of Comodoro Rivadavia.
So what have we got? Any problems along the way?
Wind 5 knots, visibility 8 kilometers, light icing, nothing unusual. I filed a standard cruising altitude of 19,000 feet.
Okay.
Have a good flight, gentlemen.
We will.
Captain Juan Raffo is flying tonight. He's a seasoned pilot with almost 7,000 flying hours. First Officer Adriano Bolatti has flown with the airline for 6 months. He's monitoring flight instruments and radio communication.
You have plans at Comodoro? I do. So I'm glad Carlos let me take a shift.
Tonight, Bolatti has swapped shifts with another Seoul pilot, Carlos Piscinato.
I had been scheduled to work on that flight, but the co-pilot had requested to work that flight instead. The co-pilot and I got along very well. He was very well versed in the aircraft systems, maintenance, and mechanics.
Welcome back. It's been 3 weeks already.
There is 1 flight attendant and 19 passengers on tonight's flight.
The typical passengers are people who work in the oil wells, people who we came to know that traveled with us often, from Neuquén to Comodoro.
Prep RPM. High. Trim position? Check. Anti-ice. As needed.
Seoul Flight 5428, you are clear for takeoff.
Roger, Seoul Flight 5428, clear for takeoff. V1. Rotate.
At 8:05 p.m., Seoul Flight 5428 lifts off from the airport in Neuquén.
Positive rate.
The plane will fly directly south from Neuquén to Comodoro Rivadavia on the Patagonian coast.
The route that we flew in the south was a regular route. We usually flew it twice a week. The landscapes are beautiful.
El paisaje es maravilloso.
Tonight, the pilots are flying a Swedish-made Saab 340 turboprop.
The Saab 340 is a twin-engine turboprop typically used for shorter flights that are connecting to larger hubs.
It lends itself to flying easily. It is a wonderful aircraft to fly.
Airspeed, 140 knots. Check. You're up. You're up. Flaps up. Flaps up. Gauge autopilot.
The passengers settle in for the 90-minute flight.
Buenos Aires, Seoul Flight 5428, reporting waypoint in Copa. We are climbing through flight level 50 for 190.
ATC Buenos Aires, received.
First Officer Bolatti relays the aircraft's position to air traffic control.
Hope we don't get in too late. The guys are waiting for us. Tonight dinner's on them. We'll get there for dinner. Don't worry.
As per their flight plan, the Saab 340 will climb to a cruising altitude of 19,000 feet.
When flying propeller aircraft, they do fly lower. They're not going to get up generally much above 25,000 feet, although occasionally they're certified for higher than that.
Looks like we're picking up some ice.
Oftentimes, particularly in mountainous terrain, turboprops will encounter icing conditions. It's very common, so it's generally not an issue.
Nothing to worry about. We're expecting some light icing. Should be better when we get to 19,000.
When in icing conditions, your first objective is to climb above it.
At 19,000 feet, water droplets freeze solid, which keeps them from clinging to the aircraft.
The challenge of flying turboprop airplanes is to evaluate the weather ahead of time and really look at the paths of least risk as it pertains to things like icing, turbulence.
Building up some ice on my wing.
With the icing conditions getting worse, the captain changes the plan.
Okay, let's get it down to where it's warmer to melt it off. Has to descend to a lower altitude, 14,000. Roger. Seoul Flight 5428 requesting descent to flight level 140.
Seoul 5428, you are cleared to 140.
As Seoul 5428 gets to the lower altitude,
All finished?
it's proving to be an uneventful flight. Then, in the cockpit,
Feel that?
the situation suddenly changes.
Propeller's vibrating.
The pilots feel some vibrations. It could be a sign of ice building up on the propellers.
Put them on max. Roger. Oh, hell. What's wrong?
I don't know.
The turboprop is suddenly pitching down and banking.
Pull back! Pull back! Pull back harder! Sleep!
The pilots struggle to get the plane under control.
Come on! We gotta come on! Come on! Come on! Come on!
But they can't escape the dive.
Come on! Come on! Radio! Mayday! 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 Seoul Flight 5428! Mayday! 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 No! 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 Pull up! Pull up! Pull up! Pull up! Pull up!
The turboprop crashes and explodes in a remote region of Patagonia. News of the accident hits Carlos Piscinato especially hard. He knew both the captain and first officer.
It was nighttime. I received a call from a crew member. I realized something was wrong. To get a call at 3 a.m. was not normal. There was just great sorrow for our colleagues.
Argentina's Civil Defense Agency sends emergency crews to the crash site. But because of its remote location, on a desert plateau in Rio Negro province, it takes hours for them to arrive.
The accident took place in a very complex area of the Argentinian Patagonia. The cold weather and the mountainous range made it very difficult for us to have safe land access.
When the crews do arrive, they find that there are no survivors. Argentinian investigators examine the crash site of Seoul Flight 5428. They need clues that might explain what brought the plane down.
22 fatalities. My God.
It's always a shock to have an accident of this magnitude. One has to set their emotions aside and be professional and serious about the job one has to perform.
Augusto de Santis is coordinating the technical teams from Argentina's Civil Aviation Accident Investigation Board, or JIAAC.
All right, let's start here, work our way out.
It's de Santis' job to determine what brought down Seoul Flight 5428. But it will be challenging. There is little of the turboprop left to examine.
The aircraft was completely destroyed, burned, and the debris was dispersed approximately 200 meters from the first point of impact.
Doesn't look good.
Two key components, the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, are found intact, but they are severely damaged.
Okay, let's ship these out, see what we get.
The first thing we did was send the data recorders and the cockpit recordings to the NTSB in the United States.
Next, investigators look for signs that indicate how the plane hit the ground.
It was very complex. Every accident, every case is absolutely unique.
Most of the debris is in front of the impact point.
The aircraft's initial impact left a 4 to 5 meter crater. That indicates a very hard initial impact.
Must have crashed at a pretty steep angle.
This pattern showed that the aircraft was out of control when it crashed, with a great dive angle, which is what caused the crater. The debris field was relatively small.
Catalog every piece, no matter how small.
Wreckage is brought to a temporary facility near the accident site. Because the crash was so catastrophic, many of the pieces are almost unrecognizable. Identifying each and every one is a painstaking process. The first priority for investigators is to determine if certain parts of the plane are missing. A key component, like an aileron detaching from the plane mid-flight, could have caused the crash.
So it's all here? Okay then. Engines.
With no evidence of a breakup before the crash, the investigators focus on the engines.
We initially tried to evaluate the engine damage to determine if they were providing power to the aircraft at the moment of impact.
The remains of the turboprop's 2 engines are sent for analysis. Technicians examine their turbines, looking for the type of damage that would indicate they were not working when the crash occurred.
Both engines presented a similar damage pattern. The visible damages, the torsion damage, led us to think that both engines were powering the aircraft at the moment of impact.
Investigators rule out engine failure. But did some other key component break down in flight?
Okay, thanks.
JIAAC investigator Horatio La Rosa joins the investigation.
Okay. Let's dig into maintenance.
Since the plane hit the ground nose first, the team wonders if a propeller malfunction could have brought the plane down. They dig into the maintenance records.
As an aeronautical engineer and manager of the technical research, the main role was to review the technical documentation.
It says the prop maintenance was incomplete.
Investigators have discovered an airworthiness directive that wasn't carried out. The order required the base of the propeller blades to be inspected for cracks.
Hey, I got something. They missed an inspection.
Could a missed crack at the base of the propeller be the culprit? Investigators inspect what's left of the propellers to see if they were working at the time of impact.
Prop blades are pretty charred. Some markings here. It's tough to say for sure if they were spinning at impact. Let's see where the propellers ended up.
Based on the position the components were found, and on their condition, we could check if they had been working or not at the moment of impact.
If an engine's propeller blades are working at impact, they are projected away from the crash site. If they aren't working, they stay near.
Left engine prop is here.
Investigators discover that the broken propellers were some distance from the rest of the wreckage.
The prop blades are some of the furthest pieces from the point of impact. They were spinning.
The great distance in which the fragments landed gives the impression that the propellers were functioning at impact.
Back to square one.
Investigators are no closer to explaining why Seoul Flight 5428 plummeted violently to the ground, killing everyone on board.
Okay, let's add the flight path.
Investigators now turn their attention to the weather conditions on the night Seoul 5428 crashed.
This is the flight path from Neuquén to Comodoro. Look what's waiting for them here. They flew right into this cold front.
The information showed that there was severe icing.
Ice on a plane can lead to disaster. In 1997, Comair Flight 3272 was on approach to Detroit Metropolitan Airport in near freezing weather when the Embraer turboprop stalled and crashed. All 29 people on board were killed. After months of investigation, the cause was finally revealed. A thin layer of ice had formed on the plane's wings, causing it to lose lift.
Did the pilots know what they were in for?
Investigators wonder if the pilots were aware of the icing conditions and took proper steps to protect the plane. It's something only one person can answer.
You were the flight's dispatcher that night.
The airline's flight dispatcher provided the crew with crucial information.
A dispatcher tells you about the passengers you will have on board, the amount of fuel you will need to go from one destination to another, and they provide you with weather conditions for the entire route.
You didn't know there was severe icy weather?
I told the pilots to expect only light icing.
So what have we got? Any problems along the way?
Wind 5 knots, visibility 8 kilometers, light icing, nothing unusual.
Can I take a look at the meteorological report you gave them? There you go. Thank you.
Investigators discover the report the flight dispatcher provided did not indicate the potential for severe icing.
The report you gave them suggested icing would be mild. But it was actually severe.
They had been dispatched with information that did not indicate this weather condition, and were told that if there was a possibility of encountering icing, it would not be severe. The information in the meteorological report showed a possible icing situation, but not as critical as they found it to be.
Where did you get your report?
Investigators need to find out why the dispatcher didn't have the right information. The team learns that because the airport's meteorological office closed at 4 p.m., the weather report the dispatcher provided was more than 5 hours old and no longer accurate.
The departure airport did not have a 24-hour meteorological service, so they departed with a weather forecast that did not anticipate severe icing.
Looks like we're picking up some ice. Nothing to worry about. We were expecting some light icing.
I believe the crew was surprised by the severe icing conditions. They were not expecting to find such conditions during their flight.
But establishing that the pilots encountered more severe weather than they expected is not enough to prove that ice brought down their plane. In icing conditions, pilots use the plane's anti-ice protection. On the Saab 340A, that consists mostly of pneumatic boots made of rubber. The boots inflate and break up the ice on the wing's leading edge. To determine if the anti-icing system was activated on the night of the crash, investigators examine a key component recovered from the wreckage, the Saab's central warning panel.
It's a panel located at the center of the cockpit that both pilots can see. It's composed of a series of light indicators that warn if there's an abnormality in any of the plane's systems.
Investigators analyze tiny filaments attached to each of the indicators. When they are lit, electricity is sent through the filaments. If they were on during impact, the hot filaments would stretch, not break. The team discovers a filament is stretched.
Ice protection was on.
It's a tantalizing lead for investigators. But did a malfunction of the ice protection bring down Seoul Flight 5428? Investigators of Seoul Flight 5428 scour the wreckage for confirmation that a failure in the ice protection system brought the plane down.
All that survived are the valves.
Okay. Let's get them checked out.
The primary function of the valves is to control the flow of pressurized air that inflates the ice protection boots. Was there a problem with the valves?
We isolated the anti-ice valve, and we analyzed what was left of it.
When they test the valve components, it's discovered that enough pressurized air was passing through the valves to inflate the boots.
Take a look. No failures.
So there was no doubt that the systems were being operated and that they were working.
If the pilots knew they were flying in ice and the ice protection system was working, then ice alone doesn't explain the accident. The team has finally received the flight data recordings from Washington. This information is crucial for uncovering the true cause of the crash.
Let's see their airspeed.
Okay.
The information from the recorders was vital to figuring out a lot of the things that the naked eye, or the elements picked up and analyzed at the crash site, could not reveal.
Okay, look here. Their airspeed dropped to 129 knots, then 126 knots.
They're in ice. They should be speeding up, not slowing down. The cruising altitude is supposed to be 19,000 feet. Instead, they level out just under 18,000 feet and slow down to less than 130.
The aircraft flight manual says that when climbing in icing conditions, the minimum speed is 160 knots. They're 30 knots below that.
Then they descend to 14,000 feet and slow again to 138 knots. And then they drop like a rock.
It's immediately obvious to investigators why the plane crashed.
They lost so much speed they stalled.
The speed was progressively decreasing, which harmed the aircraft aerodynamically.
Oh, hell!
And took it to a final stall and loss of control.
You pick up ice, you should increase your speed. Pretty basic. Why didn't these guys do that?
If the speed decreases, the pilot must increase all power to try and get out of the situation to maintain the speed of flight.
Let's see their power settings.
The investigators need to find out how the pilots could have let the plane slow to the point of stalling.
$15,000 feet. This is where they should start increasing power for the climb.
But engine power barely budges. They don't even have enough power to finish the climb.
Nothing to worry about. We were expecting some light icing. Should be better when we get to 19,000.
Once they stabilized on the 170 level, which was not the cruising level that had been planned for this flight, they did not increase the power. Instead, they let the aircraft reach that level and remain there.
Let's check their autopilot settings.
The investigators now wonder if the pilots used the correct setting for the weather conditions they were in.
The autopilot selects what the crew needs. For instance, the route, the speed, different parameters.
It was set to vertical speed after they leveled off.
Vertical speed is one of the autopilot modes used to gain altitude during flight.
Vertical speed mode is going to allow you to climb or descend at a predetermined foot per minute. So if you select 700 foot per minute, it'll climb at 700 foot per minute.
The purpose is to make climbs and descents faster. But to do this, the autopilot will maintain a steep climb angle at the expense of speed.
Vertical speed? Does that make sense?
In this flight, we found that the vertical mode was selected, and we compared this information to the aircraft's manual on how to fly under these conditions.
When investigators dig into the flight manual, they discover that the autopilot setting the pilots chose was wrong.
That's their mistake.
The pilots should have selected a different autopilot mode that maintains airspeed, not rate of climb. In vertical speed mode, the autopilot put the aircraft in a higher pitch in order to maintain the desired rate of ascent. In icing conditions, that's a problem.
It's going to expose the whole underside of the wing, and you're just going to pack on ice even faster.
The situation is made worse by the lack of anti-ice protection on the belly of the aircraft.
This ice buildup adds weight on different parts of the aircraft, which makes it less controllable. It becomes a major effort for the crew or the autopilot to control the aircraft. The performance is not the same.
Investigators conclude a heavy buildup of ice caused the plane to lose speed.
The captain had almost 7,000 flight hours, more than 2,000 on the Saab 340. And he flew this route often. He should have had the experience to handle the situation.
Only 1,300 hours for the first officer, but there's not a single red flag in his record. Looks like they both check out.
This raises a perplexing question.
They were a very qualified cabin crew. Juan had flown similar aircraft. The first officer had many hours of experience in flying under those conditions.
Should be better when we get to 19,000.
Investigators can't figure out why two experienced pilots used the wrong autopilot setting to fly through the icing conditions.
I can put it on vertical. Okay, the sooner the better. Roger.
Why did the pilots make such a big mistake?
Okay, from the top, right after takeoff.
Airspeed 140 knots. Check.
Investigators hope the cockpit voice recorder of Seoul Flight 5428 will shed light on why the pilots chose the wrong autopilot setting for the icing conditions.
Flaps up. Engage autopilot.
The team wants to know, were the pilots aware of ice early enough to prevent a dangerous level of buildup?
It was crucial for us to obtain that information. It was one of the most essential elements for us to understand what was happening, and also in providing us with information to analyze.
Hope we don't get them too late. The guys are waiting for us. Tonight dinner's on them. We'll get there for dinner.
Initially, what we heard could be said to be a normal operation. They had a personal conversation that had nothing to do with the operation.
So when did they hit the ice?
Investigators listen for confirmation that the pilots were aware of the icy conditions.
Looks like we're picking up some ice.
There it is.
Nothing to worry about. We were expecting some light icing. I don't know, Juan. Might be more than we thought. This ice makes me a bit nervous.
He's definitely worried.
Estando totalmente consciente.
They were aware that there was ice buildup and that it was progressing.
Should be better when we get to 19,000.
They're going to try and get above the icing.
If they're so worried about the ice, they should focus on the airspeed.
Keep going.
Now investigators listen for indications that the pilots knew their airspeed was a problem.
Wanted to gain speed? I can put it on vertical. Okay, the sooner the better. Roger.
They're covered in ice, losing speed, and not climbing.
And what do? Switch to vertical speed mode.
Big mistake.
Vertical speed mode actually does the opposite of what the pilots needed. It prevents the plane from picking up the speed they need to stop ice buildup.
This shocked us a lot because a person won't make a mistake because they want to. This indicates that there was a root problem that led them to make an inadequate decision in something as crucial as losing speed under icing conditions.
They're just focused on getting above the bad weather.
They can't. They're carrying too much ice to climb any higher. Keep going.
Building up some ice on my wing.
That's when the crew began to observe the ice buildup on both wings.
Okay, let's get it down to where it's warmer to melt it off. Ask to descend to a lower altitude, 14,000. Roger. Seoul Flight 5428 requesting descent to flight level 140.
Go to 14, melt the ice. Not a bad idea.
Once it became apparent that they were picking up ice quickly and they were unable to climb, they make a decision to descend and reduce the amount of ice accumulation on the airframe and find an altitude where the temperature is such that that ice would melt.
I don't think that helped very much.
The CVR reveals that conditions are no less treacherous when the pilots get to 14,000 feet.
Ice is hitting everywhere. Can you imagine how the aircraft's belly is looking?
It's okay. We're gonna stay at this altitude for now. We'll keep the icing until we get there.
But the pilots can't rely entirely on de-icing. They also need to push the throttles forward to increase power.
It was noted that while they were aware of the ice buildup and how things were progressing, they were not taking strong measures to change the situation.
Feel that? Propeller's vibrating.
First sign of stalling.
The turboprop is on the verge of an aerodynamic stall.
Oh, it's because there's too much ice on the propellers. Put them on max. Roger.
Propellers? They're misreading the signals from the plane.
They believe that the cause of the vibrations was that the propellers had too much ice buildup.
When an aircraft's propeller accumulates too much ice, the plane can begin to shake or buffet. Increasing the propeller's speed can be effective in dislodging it.
What was actually happening was a structural vibration of the entire aircraft. The aircraft was virtually dying. It was at a speed threshold where the next thing was the loss of control due to the loss of lift.
What's wrong? I don't know.
That's the stick shaker. How do they not realize that they're stalling?
The stick shaker is a device that actually will shake the control yoke in order to very viscerally communicate to the pilot that you have a low speed event and prompt the pilot to action.
But what the investigators hear next is most troubling of all.
Pull back! Pull back!
Pull back! Pull back!
Investigators are surprised by how the pilots respond when the plane begins to stall.
Pull back! Pull back!
Trying to level the plane.
Unbelievable. They're making the stall even worse.
It's a shocking revelation. The pilots are doing the exact opposite of what they should be doing.
When they encountered that stall event, what they should have done is push forward enough to break that stall and not being so worried about losing altitude, but rather regaining their airspeeds.
Investigators suspect the pilot's last-minute attempt to climb slowed them even more, making the stall unavoidable.
Come on, come on, come on! Come on, come on! Come on!
Mayday, mayday, mayday! Soul Flight 5428! Mayday, mayday, mayday!
As soon as they fight the stick shaker, they're too far gone. They can't recover.
Investigators now know why Sol 5428 crashed into a desert plateau in Patagonia.
A wrong autopilot setting here. A misread of the plane's vibrations here. Now when they finally stall, try to pull the nose up to level off instead of trying to gain speed.
What kind of training did these guys get?
We realized that we had to dig deeper in terms of training. How the company prepared two people who faced a situation they could not adequately manage.
Investigators pore through the pilot's training records.
Yeah. So, this is a regular route where bad weather is common, right?
Right.
Guess what's left out of the training program? Training on the anti-ice system. The flight simulator they used couldn't even simulate flying in icy conditions.
It's a stunning discovery.
There was only training done on how to turn on the different systems, to manage the formation of ice and how to de-ice the plane. But no training is done on what to do once the ice buildup has advanced and how to get out of that situation by increasing speed.
The revelation that the pilots were not adequately trained to fly in icing conditions is the last piece of the puzzle in this horrifying crash.
Should be better when we get to 19,000.
Investigators conclude the airline's lack of proper training led directly to the pilots selecting the wrong autopilot setting.
I can put it on vertical. Okay, sooner the better. Roger.
And to their failure to increase speed in icing conditions.
Oh, hell. What's wrong? I don't know.
The result was a stall, which they mishandled.
Pull back! Pull back!
By fighting the plane's stick pusher safety feature.
They understood the situation they were in because they were aware of the ice at all times.
Pull back harder!
The problem was that the actions they took were not effective enough in order to mitigate the situation.
In the final report, investigators recommend sweeping changes to training at all levels of commercial aviation in Argentina.
The most important recommendation that this accident generated is about the pilot's training process in emergency situations and how to handle the aircraft in icing conditions.
There's a lot of work being done to prevent this from happening again. We can't say we'll avoid all accidents, but our goal is to have the least number of accidents and the least number of casualties. That is the most important thing.